The city of Guangzhou in South China debuted women-only carriages on its metro, providing choice to female passengers. In fact, a number of countries around the world, such as Japan, Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, Egypt and the UK, already have women-only transport solutions. Do they work? And is such special care a respectful solution or a discriminating step?
Feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities.
Feminism originated in the West and has changed in the West in recent decades. In addition to overall equal rights, feminism has also been used as a more targeted tool for particular female political goals. How do such shifts impact Western society?
Women should be paid the same as men, and when they're not, their whole families get shortchanged.
In China, feminism is growing with greater female consciousness and the development of social networks. And what are more concrete ways to fight for gender equality?
The recent decision by Guangzhou to introduce women-only carriages on the metro has triggered controversy about whether the move protects women's rights or stigmatizes women as a vulnerable group. In the West, feminism has had a profound impact on society in terms of a traditional ideology, labor structure, education, and participation in elections. In China, feminism is growing in a limited space, and gender discrimination, unfairness in the job market, sexual harassment, and domestic violence continue to be real problems in modern Chinese society. To consider the development and dilemmas of feminism in both China and the West, today I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Li Jinzhao of Beijing Foreign Studies University and Professor Sarah McDonald, Director of the Great Books Program at St. Thomas University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our studio discussion here, Jinzhao and Sarah. Let's start our conversation with a recent case. As I said earlier in the lead-in, a trial women-only carriage was run in Guangdong Province. Of course, it's an experiment, but this move has triggered fierce debates on the social media. This move obviously is a policy option to protect women because, you know, some of the sexual harassment did take place in the subway. On the social media, such stories went viral. What do you think of this policy move?
Feminism is a very important issue, but severely under-discussed in China. So thank you for giving us this platform. Well, to go back to your question, it has been severely debated on women priority or women-only carriages in Guangzhou because some people argue that it is a practice of gender discrimination because the assumption is that women are the weaker gender. But on the other hand, after a very careful investigation, the Guangzhou Municipal Authority claims that they are doing so to protect the women's rights. That's the debate.
Sarah, do you think this proves or this is likely to be counterproductive? That is why it's controversial, isn't it?
I think that is one factor, but I think the claim by men that they're being discriminated against is false. No one's rights are absolute. You have to think about an individual's rights in relationship to the safety and security of everyone in society, and particularly those of vulnerable populations. And so if the men are inconvenienced slightly because they might have to wait a few minutes to get on a bus, I think that's a fair and reasonable accommodation for the women who are given a safe space where they don't have to worry about being sexually harassed.
Do you agree that a parallel comparison can be drawn between the women-only carriage in Guangzhou in China and some other extreme cases such as conservative countries like Arab countries where women must wear a veil to be respected?
Well, that's a very good question. Maybe there are some similarities among these two practices, but I think a major difference is that for the majority of women passengers on Guangzhou metro system, most of them have a choice of whether to use the women-only carriage or to use the mixed gender carriage. But for many Muslim women growing in conservative environment, they don't have a choice. they have to wear the veil.
Sarah, what do you think of the importance of feminism in a modern society? Do you think Western countries such as the United States have set a good example for developing countries? What kind of inspirations should we seek in pushing our social progress?
Well, I think I would be hesitant to hold up a Western country as a model for any other country because although feminism has been active there for a long time, certainly since the early 19th century, we still have a long way to go. And so currently the issue in the West has to do with finding ways to change the entire culture of how society views women. Because within society there are systemic and structural problems that even though women have been granted full legal, economic, civil, and political rights, they're not able to actually enjoy those freedoms because there's a sense that a woman is by nature inferior to a man. And so the real problem in the United States and in Canada, and I think probably in Europe as well, is to find ways to re-educate entire populations of people so that that position and that view is no longer at the forefront of people's minds.
Jin Zhao, you've studied in the United States for years, and are you impressed by legislation in countries like the United States that serve to protect the rights of women? And womenism is, of course, one of the prominent issues that generate headlines today for further equality and further protection.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say a little bit more about the history of feminism in China.
Right. How
Feminism is a new term, it's a very recent term. But if you consider the earlier version of feminism, which is women's liberation, women's freedom, China actually, contemporary China enjoys almost equally long history of women's liberation movement as in the United States. As our earlier feminist activists like Xiang Jingyu and Cai Chang, they were the forerunners, and actually Chinese women participated very actively in the modernization and in all the revolutions in China.
Are you saying women's lib movement in China took place under the heavy influence from the West?
Well,
for example, May the 4th movement might be the beginning of such women's lib or the Chinese version.
Well, I think there was the trend, there was the global trend at the turn of the 20th century of seeking more freedom and seeking more public spheres development. So China at that time also on the verge of modernization was influenced. So I don't think the women's movement in China lags that much behind the West or the leading Western countries.
Are you satisfied, Sarah, about equal participation in public life and public service in the West by women?
No, absolutely not. In fact, I don't think anyone can be satisfied with it worldwide. If we think about there's 194 countries in the world, give or take a country or two, and at any given time there are only 20 women who are heads of state. And that's only 10% of countries who would have a woman as the head of state. So clearly there are systemic problems that are preventing women everywhere from rising to high positions of power. And so if you take, for instance, the example of the United States, the recent campaign, the 2016 campaign of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton had maybe made some poor judgments with respect to the campaign that she ran, but those problems were compounded by the image that was presented of her in the media and by Donald Trump. She was described as a nasty woman. Her appearance was mocked. Right. And so when the issue of her emails came up, the problems just got more compounded. Whereas when Donald Trump, during the same campaign, was accused of colluding with Russia, that was a scandal that he was easily able to sort of sidestep, at least for the campaign. And there is evidence that when the FBI decided to examine Hillary Clinton's emails and made that public statement, that from that moment onward, her polling rates dropped. And so the ingrained position that exists in the West, that women are maybe better suited to be in the home than in public life. No matter what our laws say or what we say publicly, it still affects the ability of women to engage in high levels of office.
I'm aware of the sense of victimhood shared by both of you in this discussion about the importance of feminism. Sarah complained about a serious lack of women participation in politics, decision-making politics in the West. But in any society, I believe there should be a group of radicals who play the leading role in shaping a movement. For example, in recent years, a small number of Chinese feminist activists, most of them outspoken, social media savvy, women in their early 20s, they used creative campaigns to protest the strains of male chauvinism that run through contemporary Chinese society. Since 2012, they've occupied the men's public toilets to protest unfairly sized female restrooms, donned fox blood-spattered wedding dresses to protest domestic violence, and shaved their heads to protest education inequality. Now, such radical moves are more likely to generate front-page stories to arouse public attention. Now, do you think there's some ring of truth in what they did?
Well, I'm so glad you bring that up because I know quite a few of them. They are brilliant.
Are you
brilliant?
Friends?
I'm close
friends. Are you
friends.
supportive of their radical moves?
I really respect. They are very creative. They are brilliant.
They have violated the laws.
Well, I don't think they have violated any laws.
You don't think so?
No, they haven't.
But why some of them were arrested?
Well, I think our society is not really giving enough space for people to exercise their activism. That's for public good and for public safety. They are doing everything under our legal permit, our legal system. They are not violating any law.
And yet they are viewed as troublemakers. Sarah, are you surprised that in our country, an Oriental culture, the government tends to have a very limited tolerance for such activities, although the intent of those activists aim to provide public service, to provide public goods for women whose restrooms are unfortunately pretty small compared with men's restrooms?
I don't know that I'm surprised by that, but I would certainly echo the comments that those kinds of activities are necessary. I think when we're talking about whether or not someone has broken the law, you also have to address whether the law is just or unjust.
That's a very good point.
Because not all laws are correct laws. Laws have to be founded on rational principles, and they have to be promulgated fairly, and they have to account for the good of the whole. And if women make up half the population and the laws are disregarding their needs, then I don't know how you could argue that those laws are just.
Yeah, for instance,
it seems you are suggesting that there should be a Chinese version of the First Amendment to protect women's rights in China. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Li Jindao of Beijing Foreign Studies University and Professor Sarah McDonough, director of the Great Books program at St. Thomas University. We're discussing the importance of feminism, which has aroused burgeoning public awareness about the seat, position, and importance of equal rights of women in our traditional society. I'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Come back. Jindao, on January the 21st, 2017, more than 500,000 people showed up for the Women's March in Washington, D.C. And Sarah, hundreds of similar protests took place around the globe. The Chinese government rarely allows any form of street protests. Our politics, in our politics, this is very sensitive. To have street revolutions, street protests, this is a very different culture. More and more Chinese are starting to speak up for women's rights via the internet, however. So, my question, Jindao and Sarah, how do you see the function of the internet and social media in feminism's progress in China?
First, let me go back very briefly to talk about the legalization of women's rights issues. Actually, in terms of formal protection of women's rights, China is faring very well. Actually, women's rights are written into our national constitution. because it's written directly into the Constitution, of course, we also have a series of other laws to protect women's rights. But the problem is how to carry out those laws. For instance, we have a very latest, the anti-domestic violence law. And the matter is how to practice, how to make sure that the well-intended laws are effectively carried out and practiced. So to go back to the march, the January 21st March, I originally planned to go. I really wanted to be there, to be on the scene, to see how women have their right to show that they're angry. They don't want to be sexually molested and genderly stereotyped, and even they have the right to voice their anger against the newly elected president. I wanted to be there because I believe women have rights to be angry, but in a proper way, and going into the streets is a very good format to voice collective demand or to have collective claim. But going to the streets is also very symbolic because eventually we want to get things done. Going to the streets is just the beginning, it's not the end. The end is to get things done.
Almost from day one of our founding back in 1949, I mean, the People's Republic of China, late Chairman Mao Zedong called for gender equality, saying women could shoulder half the sky. However, in our Politburo, we know representation of women proves to be a very embarrassing phenomenon, very embarrassing. Having said this, let's look at why Hillary Clinton was defeated in the campaign. She's not alone, it seems. Park Geun-hye, former president of ROK, Rousseff of Brazil were both impeached.
Yes.
And Hillary lost the campaign. So it seems the world is still biased against women one way or another. Is that something common, or do we use a phrase like common but differentiated? With different levels of economic development, things could happen in both developed and developing nations. Sarah.
I think that's an interesting question because we also would have to think then of Angela Merkel, who I would say in North America.
And Theresa May, Prime Minister of the UK.
Absolutely. Yeah. But Angela Merkel specifically, because she, I think, is probably one of the most influential political leaders currently within North America and Europe. So alongside the image of the women who have not been able to break through the glass ceiling, so to speak.
President Trump refused to shake hands with her.
Yes, he did. And I'm not sure that hurt her at all, to be honest with you. I'm from actually Canada, not the United States, and our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, had before
he's a feminist.
He's a feminist, and he, by principle, he insisted that his cabinet be 50% men and 50% women.
That's brilliant.
Which would be a first time in our country. And I'm not sure that quotas are the way to ensure that women share access to office, but certainly it's a step by which you can model the possibility of a woman having power, acting rationally, doing good works in the public, that then can encourage other women, younger women, to follow the same path. And I think that goes back to your question about women being taught to be modest and polite, and we're maybe too reticent. And so if you can provide them with models of strong female leaders, that allows them to think that maybe that's a possibility for them as well.
President Trump has not only insulted Muslims, but also women, if you look at the locker room conversation. Particularly with the ascendance of an American president with a track record of insulting women, can Chinese feminists depend on support and shelter from the US? What is the impact of Western feminism on China's society? What is China's own solution for feminist development?
Well, on that front, I think American feminists and Chinese feminists are sisters. They have some common goals to reach, which is to fight against this kind of fraternal culture, this patriarchal trend of objectifying women, talking about women as if they are just the body parts. That they do not really respect enough their wisdom, their brain. We don't have this concept of locker room conversation in China, but in our media, in our mainstream media, it's very common to celebrate or praise a woman, such as the interpreter or journalist, as beauty journalist, beauty athlete, as if their appearance matters the most. So I think on that ground, we, as international feminist sisters, we can do a lot of things together. We can inspire each other.
I wonder
Absolutely.
whether you were in Huairou, a settler county of Beijing, back in the year 1995 when the NGO sessions took place. They were sessions of the 4th World Women Conference. That's the first time China hosted such a world event, and China was not prepared for the NGO sessions. I was there covering the...
You were lucky.
Yeah, I was there.
I wasn't that lucky.
To cover the curiosity of the locals about whether we're going to have street protests by sex workers or gay people. You know, the Chinese were utterly ignorant about
At that time,
what would happen when night falls. So.
That was indeed an opening experience for a lot of Chinese women and activists. I think it not on the ground that Chinese women's rights were very underdeveloped, or Chinese women's basic rights, such as equal pay for equal work or equal access to higher education and promotion. Even at that time, Chinese women were doing pretty well, but they were not aware probably of the diversity of all different kinds of feminist groups, human rights groups, sexual minority groups. So the Huairou, I'm glad you were lucky to be at the non-government section, so which was more colorful, even more diverse.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
I mean,
more dynamic.
Very exciting experience that I went through. Now, one sensational issue about the Huairou NGO sessions back in 1995 was whether the locals would be able to see demonstrations or protests by sex workers. And in the West, it comes as no surprise that these workers are protected by law. They have their own association, they have their own society. But in China, though we find ourselves facing the large army of underground prostitutes. There's no such law to protect their legitimate rights, right? Well, quote unquote. There's a very strong resistance against such legislation. Li Yinhe, widow of Wang Xiaobo, has tried in vain for many years to call for legislation protecting women's rights, particularly sex workers. But that proves to be a very, very difficult move. What do you think of the progress you have made in the West? And many Chinese tourists may have been impressed by the Netherlands, where everything can be made legal through the use of referendums. But in China, that's a remote dream, I'm afraid.
Well, I mean, I think it's quite important because often people who work in the sex trade industry don't have those legal protections, and as a result, they're subject to all kinds of violence and harassment. And even not just women, but young girls. And the difficulty is that if you make it illegal, for instance, or you don't protect the rights of sex trade workers, that industry is going to continue regardless. And as a result, vulnerable populations will be continued to be discriminated against and harmed.
And
by
there
at
will be a
least
lot of harms coming from HIV/AIDS or venereal diseases,
Absolutely.
tax evasion.
If you at least regulate it, then you can draw lines around it and allow for both public safety but also individual protection.
Do you think China needs to be educated about equal rights? I'm not talking about the political implications of human rights. I'm focusing on women's rights. What can be done to let the general public know more about the importance of feminism through the use of social media?
First of all, I have to say that there are different feminisms because even feminists do not always totally agree with each other. For instance, there are feminists who think that the priority of the state policy and the state practice is on the traditional or long-term unresolved issues such as equal pay for equal work, equal retirement age, equal promotion, breaking glass ceilings. But other feminists think that sexual rights, sexual minority rights, or sex workers' rights are equally important. Some feminists are not necessarily in favor of lesbian feminism or other types of feminism. So
Or,
I would say there is a wide
single,
range.
Single-parent families.
Of
need
feminism.
to be protected.
Yeah.
So
But
are you suggesting
the bottom
Guangdong-
line is to respect women's decision-making process and to respect women's capacity and power of following their heart, of making their own decisions. So and giving women equal opportunities and equal chances.
There's no doubt that the remarkable progress has been made in the Chinese society about liberating women from household chores, from the kitchens, and giving them equal pay for the equal amount of work. However, family planning policies seem to be yet another vulnerability for Chinese women. Coercive use of the abortion. That goes against, of course, what the Catholic Church calls for and stands for. But in China, do you think this is a shame? And do you think we have done a lot to protect women's rights?
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier in the first half of the conversation, on the one hand, we have formally legalized the laws and the practices and regulations, but on the other hand, we don't have really thorough practice of those laws and regulations.
It's the execution that matters more.
The process of carrying out all the laws and regulations. So we have been advocating equality for men and women both at home and in public sphere, but we are far from realizing the equality. Even in family, women are still expected to do most of the household chores, and men are still expected to be the breadwinner, or men are still expected to be more successful, more powerful, more dominant as their wife. So there's still a long way to go. Women are expected to only put half of their time and energy on their work, and women are expected to retreat, to withdraw from their dedication to work and a PhD degree. A lot of my students, my brilliant women students, they are reluctant to continue their pursuit of a PhD degree because they're worried.
Sarah, I promise that today's discussion would only be the beginning of a good journey for rediscovering the merits and integrity of women, the importance of feminism. However, there are some conservatives in some quarters of the Chinese society who say the equality, gender equality, must be conditional. Absolute equality is something that is unrealistic for an Oriental culture like China. With that, we keep in mind an open question for the next round of discussion. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.